Okay, we're going to look at 4.4 again today. I'm going to call this 4.4 part 2. Okay, but we're still looking at graphs of sine and cosine. All right, so let's start by just looking at a regular sine function. Okay, this is our parent function. All right, so we're going to add on a few things to what we did yesterday. Okay, first of all, our period is 2 pi. We learned that yesterday. Okay, our amplitude is 1. Also learned that yesterday. Okay, so the period is 2 pi. That means one full cycle of this graph is 2 pi units long. So if I start at 0, one full cycle of this graph will end at 2 pi because that's the period. Okay, and we're going to talk about labeling these interval points. So yesterday I just kind of drew them in and we graphed. Today we're actually going to label these points. Okay, and so to label these points, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my period and divide by 4, and I get pi over 2. Okay, that means that each one of these intervals is pi over 2 units long. Okay, so if I decide I'm going to start my graph at 0, this first interval would be 0 plus pi over 2. Okay, so if this is pi over 2 units long, if I start at 0 and I go here, this is going to be pi over 2. Okay, then if I add on another pi over 2, right, I'm going to do pi over 2 plus pi over 2, and you're treating pi just like it's a variable here when you're adding these. Okay, so this is essentially like 1/2 plus 1/2. Okay, 1 pi over 2 plus 1 pi over 2 is 2 pi over 2, which simplifies to pi. Okay, then I'm going another pi over 2 units, so I'm saying pi plus pi over 2. Okay, but I need common denominators here. So 2 pi over 2, which we actually already had up there, plus pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. Okay, and then you really should check this last interval. If I take 3 pi over 2 and I add pi over 2, I get 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. Okay, so I just confirmed that this last interval is pi over 2 units long. Okay, so my critical points here, the points where this graph is going to cross the x-axis for this first period are 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Okay, when we graph a sine function, okay, at our starting point, wherever we decide to start that graph, we're at the x-axis. Okay, then we go up to the max, back to the x-axis, down to the min, back to the x-axis. And that is one full period of that graph. Okay, I could continue on and graph another period and go to 4 pi. I can also go the other way in the negative direction. Okay, so if I go to the left, right, one full period is still 2 pi units. This is still a distance of pi over 2. So if I go in a negative direction, I am subtracting, right? 0 minus pi over 2 is negative pi over 2. Negative pi over 2 minus pi over 2 is negative 2 pi over 2, or negative pi. And negative pi minus pi over 2 is negative 3 pi over 2. Negative 3 pi over 2 minus pi over 2 is negative 4 pi over 2, which is negative 2 pi. Okay, the graph continues the pattern, so I would be at my min, at the x-axis, at my max, at the x-axis. Okay, and so there's my graph. Okay, cosine, right, let's just really quickly touch base on, or not touch base, but look at that one, okay? Everything is exactly the same except the shape of the graph. Well, even the shape of the graph actually is the same, but just a little bit different. Okay, so at the starting point, these critical points are going to be exactly the same, and I'm going to find them exactly the same. So if I start at 0, okay, my first critical point, pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, which is pi, 3 pi over 2. Same thing in the negative direction, negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2. Okay, if I graph just this first period, okay, and I start at the origin, for cosine, the only difference is I start at the max. Okay, then I go to the x-axis, min, x-axis, max. Okay, so one full period of that cosine graph looks like this. Okay, x-axis, min, x-axis, max. Okay, one full, or another full period, okay, and looks like that. Okay, so let's look at graphing some functions. Okay, and I'm going to graph quite a few functions today as we go through these videos. So if I write one up here and you know how to graph it, you can skip that one. Okay, but I'm going to talk about these graphs a little more in depth today. All right, so graph 2 periods of each function. All right, and we are going to start with y equals 2 sine of x. Okay, this 2 is a vertical stretch, and what that vertical stretch affects is my amplitude. Okay, my period stays the same. If my period is 2 pi, that means the length of each one of those intervals of my critical points, okay, between critical points is going to be pi over 2. Okay, I'm going to start at 0. I'm not going to do anything crazy. Okay, my amplitude is 2. Remember, the amplitude is the distance or the height of half of that wave. Okay, my period is 2 pi. I'm going to start at 0. Okay, that means that each one of these intervals is pi over 2 units long. 0 plus pi over 2 is pi over 2. Okay, that's 2 pi over 2. That is 3 pi over 2. Okay, and I need to graph 2 intervals, or 2 periods. And today I'm going to do negative and positive. You don't have to do that. If it says graph 2 periods, you can continue on in the positive direction if you want. Okay, so I start at 0, I go up to my max, I'm at 0 at my x-axis, down to my min, back at 0. Okay, so this is a pretty standard sine graph, just has a vertical stretch which changes my amplitude. Right, so stretches the graph up, makes it taller. Okay, let's look at y equals cosine of 2x. Okay, so my amplitude here is 1. I don't have a vertical stretch or a vertical shrink. Okay, but my period does change, right? This is a horizontal compression or horizontal shrink. So I would say 2 pi over 2, right? So my period is pi. Okay, that means that the length between my critical points is going to be pi divided by 4. Okay, so if I were to lay this graph out, okay, I'm still going to call 0 my starting point, but one period of this graph is pi. Okay, if I start at 0, so I'm just looking at this first period right here from 0 to pi. Okay, that means that this second critical point is going to be 0 plus pi over 4, so that's easy. That's just pi over 4. And you don't have to write these down here. I just am, just to make it a little bit easier. Okay, so then my second one, I've got pi over 4 plus pi over 4, right? Pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. Okay, then I'm going to add pi over 2 plus pi over 4. Okay, we just said pi over 2 is 2 pi over 4. Okay, I need those common denominators, right? To add these, you can also just multiply the top and the bottom by 2 to get your common denominators. So that is going to be 3 pi over 4. And if I take 3 pi over 4 and I add pi over 4, I should get pi, which I do. Okay, so that just confirms that that last interval is also pi over 4 units long. Okay, and it's going to be the same in the negative direction. So here's these critical points. Like I said, you don't have to write those out. I just was writing them out down there just so I can organize this a little bit. Okay, so my first one is negative pi over 4, and I have negative pi over 2, and I have negative 3 pi over 4. Okay, my amplitude is 1. When I'm graphing a cosine function, I start at the max, go to the x-axis, min, x-axis, max. Okay, same thing in the negative direction, max, x-axis, min, x-axis, max. And there's 2 periods of that cosine graph.